All right, so if you want to turn, we'll be in 2 Timothy chapter 4 today. But as you turn there, just I think context is very important, a little bit of background to understand sort of where we are in the history of what's going on in the New Testament. So this letter there's a couple dates that it could be given to. I take the date that was probably written around 67 AD, which means that we are in the process. We're sort of in the middle of a lot of historical events that are happening. So just 2 years, or 3 years rather, prior to this, you had the burning of Rome, which if you know anything about the history of Rome had 3/4 of it were burnt down. Nero, the emperor at the time, blames it on the Christians. So after this point, Christianity is being persecuted pretty hard because they have been blamed for the fires in Rome. And so you have that happening 3 years prior, and you're in the middle of a process in which the Jews and the Romans are in a pretty heated, contested battle. You have the fall of Jerusalem that's about to come in 70 AD, so we're just a few years away from that. But you're pretty much smack dab in the middle of sort of the Jewish revolt, the war against the Romans. So there's a lot of tension, is all I'm saying. There's a lot of tension in this moment. And Paul is writing this letter to Timothy, someone he calls a son in the faith, someone he cares a lot about. And the part that we're going to look at specifically in chapter 4 are going to be the last words that he gives him, that he writes him. Shortly after this, it's believed that Paul is martyred. So these are the last words that Paul is going to send to tell his son in the faith. And obviously there's a lot going on in his world. There's a lot that Paul is dealing with, that Timothy is dealing with at the church that he is at. And so there's a lot that Paul could potentially tell Timothy. A lot of things about politics, a lot of things about the world, a lot of things about the revolt happening. There's a lot of advice he could give him. But he decides, what we're going to see here in a moment, he decides to tell him about the most important thing, that everything else should be viewed through. But we kind of have to understand what's happened, what Paul has told him up to this point to really get the impact and the oomph, I suppose you could say, of chapter 4. In chapter 1, he sort of laid out and reminded Timothy of this great faith that he's received from his mother and his grandmother. And he sort of contrasts that to those that have not been faithful. And he tells him at the beginning of chapter 4, like, Timothy, just be strengthened by the grace of Jesus Christ. That's in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1. Because he knows he's seeing a lot of movement happening. With all of these things happening in the background in the culture, there are those that are either leaving the faith or sticking very firmly to it. And he's reminding Timothy, like, you have examples of good endurance and you have examples of really bad endurance. But he urges him on to hold fast to the faith he can find in Jesus. He goes on to tell him shortly this gospel in 2 Timothy chapter 2, 8 through 10, sort of this shortened gospel. And it's important to understand what Paul's saying here because he's going to mention it in chapter 4. And he tells him basically, Paul describes the gospel in short by saying that the gospel is the message of Jesus Christ risen from the dead, the offspring of David, enabling salvation that leads to eternal glory. This is what Paul urges him to talk about. And he ends chapter 3 by telling him some very specific things. He says, like, that's the gospel that we preach. You can see people enduring well. You can see people falling away. But there's some things that he tells him, like, stay away from certain things. He tells him to stay away from quarreling, arguing about small things. He says, stay away from babbling, fruitless discussions that lead nowhere. Flee, in fact, from youthful passions, which he sort of shows that youthful passions are in opposition to righteous living. And he says, stay away from foolish conversations. He's urging, he's like, there's a lot going on, Timothy. There's a lot of conversations you could get into. There's a lot of things you could, like rabbit holes you could go down. There's a lot of arguments that you could have, but like avoid those things. As tempting as they are to get into, avoid those things. And he explains in the beginning of chapter 3 why. He explains that, like, if you're involved in those things, if you're so focused on all of that just dribble and discussion and just argumentation, you're going to miss some things. He actually says in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 5, that if like you're focusing on those things, you're going to really miss this thing that's happening elsewhere in the culture. But he says, understand this is chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. He says, "But understand this, in the last days there will come a time of difficulty, for people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness but denying its power." And he says, just avoid such people. Now, why would he say? He's like, obviously this is happening in his time as well, but he's saying like avoid all of this foolishness, avoid these types of people. And he points out that you should be able to avoid, you're not going to be able to avoid these difficult times. In fact, he says in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12, he says, if you actually follow the Lord, you can expect persecution and harassment. So he's building this entire letter with this all going in the background, with all of these things that could be happening, likely are happening in the churches Timothy is over. And he ends in chapter 3 by urging Timothy to remember again the faith that he talked about in chapter 1, urging him to remember the faith that was passed down to him and the trustworthiness that he can have in the scriptures. And then we get to chapter 4. And it says this. Chapter 4, starting in verse 1. "I charge you in the presence of God and of Jesus Christ, who is the judge of the living and the dead, and by his appearing and his kingdom, preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching. For the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but have itching ears. They will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander off into myths. As for you, always be sober-minded, endure suffering, do the work of the evangelist, and fulfill your ministry." And this is the text that I want to really focus in on today. Because I think there are so many correlations, so many comparisons, so many things happening in the day that Paul writes this word to Timothy that are almost identical to not only our time, but just history repeating itself over and over again. There is no lack of babble or controversy or topic that you could or maybe did get into on Thanksgiving dinner. There is no lack of argumentation that could be had, no lack of rabbit hole that you could go down. No, you could have endless conversations on things. And Paul, in his last letter to someone that he loves dearly, he says, just avoid those things. They take up so much time. They take up so much energy. But Timothy, what I want you to focus on is the thing he charges him with in chapter 4, verse 1. He says, "I charge you in the presence of God and Jesus Christ, who is to judge the living and the dead, and by his appearing and his kingdom." Harvey mentioned Advent, right? This is first Sunday of Advent. This recognizing that Jesus is coming back. He already came once. He's coming back again. And Paul uses this very eschatological, this second coming type of language here when he charges Timothy to do something. He's like, yeah, all of this is going on. Totally aware of it, Timothy. I know, but this is what I want to charge you with in the presence of God and Jesus Christ in your head, knowing that he's coming back again. This is what I want you to do. What he's about to tell him, he wants to have that weight on it. This isn't just me telling you, maybe do this. This is Paul saying, you need to understand God and Jesus, he's in the presence of God. With the mind knowing that Jesus is coming back to what? Judge the living and the dead, to bring his kingdom. With that knowledge, what should you then be doing? Well, he's already told them, don't mess with all the silly things. He says, rather, in verse 2, preach the word. What's this word? Well, he's already told us this word, this understanding that Jesus has risen from the dead, that he is the promised Messiah, that he is the one that eternal life can be found in. That word, he says, focus on that. There's a lot of noise, Timothy, but I want you to focus on that. Why? Because Jesus is coming back. And you can lose focus on that very, very easily with all of the noise. Now, again, you understand, Timothy is in an empire that is as at war with itself, essentially. I mean, not too long from here, even the Roman people are going to get tired of Nero and assassinate him. There's a lot of stress. Okay, that's all I'm saying. They have political stress. They have wars going on. Taxation is through the roof. They got a lot going on that can easily distract them from the gospel. And Paul kind of pulls Timothy back in, saying, don't. It's easy, but don't get distracted by that. Preach the word. That's your focus. It says, be ready in of season and out of season. Reprove, rebuke, and exhort. Now, obviously, in this time that he's writing him, it's a bit out of season. There's persecution heavily coming down from Nero. Christians are being killed, actually put on lampstands in Nero's garden, lit on fire. Not an uncommon thing. It's sort of out of season. Now, before this, there was a little persecution, nothing like what's happening now, and it was a bit more in season. But Paul's point is this, whether it's easy to talk about Jesus or whether it's outlawed to talk about Jesus, you got to be ready to do it either way. And both come with difficulty. In season, do you know how hard it is to talk? And I used to be this Christian, and sometimes I'm still convicted of it, that sometimes it's really hard to talk to some of you that think you're believers, and you're like, hey, that's a sin. You're like, oh, this is really not. You shouldn't be doing this. Oh, well, I need a verse. It's sometimes in season, it's even harder to preach the gospel because people have walls up. And they're like, I said a prayer one time. I could poke that more. I'm not going to. The point is, it's hard in season sometimes to preach the gospel because people think they've already heard it. And they don't understand it. And then there's times that it's harder to preach the gospel because literally death is what comes from that. We have no knowledge of this at all. Our brothers and sisters in other countries do. Knowing that this morning they had to get up and basically sneak to where they were going to open probably one Bible to hear the word, knowing that if they get caught, it's going to mean death for them or somebody else. But Paul says, whether it be in season or out, be prepared to preach this word. What is this word? That Jesus rose from the dead, that he is the Messiah, and that he can save you. Amen. And how does he say to do it, though? Well, he says this is how you do it. Reprove, rebuke, and exhort. Reprove essentially just means call out the sin. Simply just saying, that thing there is wrong. And then reprove, just saying this is why it's wrong. But exhort, there's a better way. He doesn't just say beat people over the head, Timothy, with the Bible and hope that they get it. He says point it out, tell them why, and point them to something better. There's plenty of sins in our own lives or in other people's life that you can point out, say why, but if you stop there and don't say Jesus is better than this, The greed and the desire to have more things might fill you now, but there's a better way than that. That desire to lust after people, to go after things that aren't yours, there's a better way than that. To slander and gossip other people to make yourself feel there's a better way than that. Amen. And he says, so as you preach this word, this fact that you can be freed from your sins, have eternal glory with Christ, as you do that in season and out of season, there's a way to do it. And it's to say, that's sin. This is where it says it. There's a better way. Amen. Not super complicated process is all I'm saying. And then he tells them to do it in a specific way. Second half of verse 2, with complete patience and teaching. Paul understands that the people that Timothy is going to talk to are the people he's already described in the chapter before. They're not going to want to hear it, but he says, do this with patience and teaching, knowing they're not going to want to hear it, knowing they're going to push back, knowing that they're going to come at you with some vitriol, and you're just going to have to come back with love and walk alongside them, teaching them through it. Let's break this down. When I was a kid, still now, I was terrible at math. Don't ever ask me to do a checkbook or a math problem or anything else. It's going to end poorly for you. Find someone that can do it better. My father, if he was here, could attest to many days at the kitchen table where he was just probably just willing to give up on all things. Just like, I'm done. This child is, we need to send him somewhere else. He's just not smart. But he sat there and he walked it. I can do basic math now because he was patient and teaching through it. This is the picture that Paul sets up for Timothy. Like, it's not going to be you tell them about Jesus and, oh, they get it and they're great. It's like you're rebuking, reproving, exhorting. And as you're doing that, you are patiently teaching them. Very rarely, if ever, does someone get saved and they understand all of it and their lives are just cleaned up immediately. This is discipleship. This is the process of that. That just means walking alongside other people. This is what the body is for. And he says, when you're preaching the gospel, guess what will happen? People will come to Christ. But when they come to Christ, you're going to have to teach them and be patient with them and do this well. He's already told him in chapters 1 through 3, like, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of pressure to not be faithful to Jesus. So if, in case you want to level this up to level 50,000, you're going to have to be enduring that as you're trying to be patient and teaching with them, knowing that there's a lot that could draw them away. A lot that you're trying to stay focused on because it's very tempting for you as well. But he tells them to do it with patience and teaching. Verse 3, for a time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander off into myths. That's right. Now, again, this is happening in his day as well. But he's just warning Timothy, just expect that. Just expect for every time you preach the gospel and you reprove and you rebuke and you exhort, there's going to be somebody else on the other side going, no, you don't need, that's fine. And they're going to have just as many points to draw people away as you are trying to draw people to. He says expect, don't think it's going to be easy. For every sin that we can pull out in this scripture, that God has clearly said, this is right, this is wrong. There is somebody else that I can probably point you to right now that would say, no, it's not. It's fine. And have just as many resources for why it's not. Paul's not concerned really about that. He's just saying, just expect that. Don't expect it'll be easy for you. Don't expect that it's not going to come with some sort of pushback or harassment. But expect that people will, of course, have other people that will say the opposite thing you say, Timothy. But this is why Timothy has already been urged to take hope in Christ, to have faith in the scriptures, to know they are right in what they say, to focus on the gospel. This is where he ends, though. In verse 5, he says, as for you, always be sober-minded. Endure suffering, do the work of the evangelist, and fulfill your ministry. He says, that's going to happen. Duh. But for you, as for you, yes, all of these things are happening around you. All of that's going to be said about you or against what you're saying. But as for you, he says, always be sober-minded and focused. Endure suffering and do the work of an evangelist. Sober-minded, just being focused. You're not distracted. You know what's happening. He's already encouraged him to do that. Endure suffering. He's already told them in this letter, if you pursue the gospel, if you pursue the way of the Lord, that is going to happen. You're not going to be able to get away from it. Don't think you can. If you follow Christ, there will always be someone calling you names that you'd rather not be called. And you're going to have to endure that. Amen. And maybe you haven't been there. Maybe you haven't. But I've talking to many pastors. I've been in that pathway myself. Maybe you have as well, as you've preached the gospel, that there are names that I didn't even know existed that I've been called before. But they do exist. And there is a temptation in that moment to be like, wow, that hurt a little bit. Like, is this worth it? I mean, we haven't even, again, we have no comparison to what he's talking about or our brothers and sisters in other countries are talking about. But there are people that will lose jobs over the preaching of the gospel. There are people that will lose their families over the preaching of the gospel. There are people that will lose their ability to even operate in the world that they're in because they preach the gospel. Again, we don't have any concept of that, but just know that Paul's like, hey, expect that. And then when that happens, he doesn't encourage him to run from it. He encourages them to endure it well. And he's already given examples of enduring it well at the beginning of this letter to him. He says, do you remember your mother and your grandmother enduring well, teaching you the ways of the Lord? Well, there's also people, all of them left me in Asia. They didn't endure well. He says, but I encourage you to endure well. Like, expect that. When it comes, take the hit. And do the work of an evangelist. The spreading of this word. And in doing so, he says, you fulfill your ministry. Now again, Paul here is obviously talking to Timothy specifically. But this isn't anything specifically pastoral in the sense of it only applies to Timothy or just pastors, but actually Christians in general. And maybe we don't have a Nero that's burning Christians in his lawn. And we have no Jewish rebellion that's rising up against the Romans and that fight's happening. But we have no lack of war and picking sides on wars in this world that we live in. Now maybe we don't have like political strife. I can't find an example of that. But we have political strife. We have economic strife. And Paul's point is this, like, yes, you can talk about a lot of different things. You can go down a lot of different rabbit holes. You can have a lot of different opinions. And he doesn't necessarily say, like, he says, avoid those. It's not that those are unimportant. It's just that you have to view them through the correct lens. Because it's really easy to be drugged this way or the other and focus specifically on your opinion, but not see it through the lens of the gospel. This is what I mean. During this specific time, we've already mentioned that you have the Jews rising up against the Romans, a war that will eventually lead in the destruction of Jerusalem. And the Christians during this time that are in Jerusalem remember the words of Jesus. And as they remember the words of Jesus, decide to flee Jerusalem because they know something's going to happen. Now, in our day, they'd be like, well, they should rise up and help the Jews get justice, right? Well, there was a very specific understanding within these early Christians' mind that they shouldn't take a life. They remember Jesus' prophecy about Jerusalem being surrounded, and so they leave. There's a lot of different sides they could have taken, is what I'm saying. There's a lot of different actions they could have done to sort of get in politically, but they specifically say, this is the word of Jesus. This is what he told us to do, and therefore this is what we're going to do. And so they disperse out before Jerusalem is destroyed. My point is, they see their lives and the actions they should take through the lenses of a risen Jesus and what he said. And it's really easy for us to have arguments and babbles and strife with people and forget to even mention the gospel. And this is exactly what's happening when Paul writes to Timothy. He says, there's so much happening right now, Timothy. There's so much to get distracted from. There's so much to get down about. There's so much to just be like, I don't know what to do. But he tells him in verse 1 of chapter 4, remember that Jesus is coming back. Like, remember that. And in light of that, know that there is one thing you should be doing. And that is preaching the word. How often have we thought about the reality of Jesus coming back? Because I think far too often we're in the same sort of mindset of the people that Peter writes to. Because Peter goes like, he's not slow in coming. Like, he's coming, even though there's a lot of people that are like, yeah, but it's been a while. And he's like, he's still coming. And sometimes we get so caught up in everything else because we forget that. We forget that one day Jesus is coming back and he will judge the living and the dead. That his kingdom will be set up fully and there will be no more sin and he will rule over all and it will be done with. Amen. And we forget that. And because we forget that, we settle for trite, silly things to talk about. And we forget about the one thing we should be talking about. This gospel that Paul has already told Timothy to declare. This reality that Jesus has risen from the dead. That he is the promised Messiah. That he can give you freedom from your sin and bring you into eternal glory with God. Paul calls this other places in 2 Corinthians the ministry of reconciliation. The fact that as believers we have been given this ministry to tell others that the God that you are apart from, you can be made one with through Jesus Christ. So all of this stuff that you think is so important and you struggle with so much, you can be free from it. Hallelujah. All of the self-help, all of the anxiety, all of the stress that is closing in around, there is freedom to be found from it in Jesus Christ. Amen. And he says, Timothy, the people you're around, they're so focused on everything else. And there's a hint here that Timothy maybe is starting to focus on these things too. And Paul is drawing him back saying, I'm about to die. And the one thing I want you to know isn't like great words about politics or great words about how to participate in society. But the one thing I want you to remember before I don't get to tell you anything else. Preach the word. And this is how to do it. And God forbid we forget that and settle for trite, silly things. Because it's really easy to turn on the radio or the television or get online and see 1,000 things that could take up your day, take up your mental energy. There isn't a lack of people to be aggravated against or to be on the opposite side of. That is in abundance currently. And it will only continue to be in more abundance, I'm sure, as the next couple years pass. So this word that Paul gives to Timothy is a word I think we need to hear. Yes, that's there. That's not important if you approach it outside of the gospel. So for every conversation you have about world events, politics, economics, the state of things, how many conversations do we have about this gospel that we say we believe can free people from sin? Amen. How many times do we declare that as the answer and not just a different political person? How many times do we declare Jesus as the king of our lives versus we just need to switch some stuff over here and it'll make it better? Paul's declaration to Timothy is that, yes, there's a lot of things happening. There's a ton of things that could distract you. There's a ton of things that are going to take your time. But this one thing is what he wants him to know before he knows he's going to go die. I'm not going to be able to say anything to you anymore. I'm never going to see you again. But this is the last thing I want you to remember. Preach the gospel. Amen. And do it in such a way that you say, this is sin. This is why there's a better way. And just keep doing that. And when people come to Christ, be patient with them and walk with them and expect that, yes, the world's going to be a mess. Did you forget sin's a thing? Yeah, it's going to be rough. but you declare Jesus and hold hope into a Christ that is better than all of these things. So even in the midst of suffering, even in the midst of eventually Jerusalem being destroyed, eventually the Christians being spread out throughout the world, because the focus is on Jesus and not these other things, the gospel then spreads dramatically to where eventually that's the reason you're here today, because they didn't focus on silly things, they focused on Jesus. And let us, 100 years from now, if everything's still here, our ancestors look back and say, I'm just really glad they were focused on Jesus. I don't know a whole lot about them, but I know they loved Christ. Let that be said of us. Let's pray and then we'll be dismissed.